Hello and welcome to this edition of the Inspire Online Book Club. This month we've been reading a book called Traces by Patricia Wiltshire. She is a forensic scientist. She calls herself a forensic ecologist, and she's a scientist who's been helping the police for many years in quite groundbreaking work, looking at how things like spores, seeds, pollen, elements of the natural world can find themselves on people's boots, car tyres, and of course the bodies of victims of unpleasant crimes. She's been working out how that can help the police in their inquiries and how it can help to discover perpetrators of crimes, and it can help find out all sorts of interesting things which we're used to seeing on the television. And this is kind of a real life documentary book about how those things actually happen. It's an interesting book to choose for the book club. I think some of us are going to have some quite strong things to say about that. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Anne Penn from Inspire, who's done some of these before. And also now we have four guests who are going to be talking with us. We've got Terry, Adaeze, Janice and Anne W, and they're going to be talking with me about their thoughts and feelings about the book. I think we'll start. Can we start with Terry, because we were talking just before about the personality of the writer of this book, and I wondered if you wanted to start off saying something about that.
Well, I was really looking forward to reading it because the focus was forensic science, which I'm interested in, and also nature, which is another passion of mine. But I found I suppose it was her opening, not her opening statement, but within that first chapter, pardon me, I'm a Christian. I don't expect, other people to believe what I believe, but I felt rather attacked by her words, absurd assumption that, there is eternal life, etc., etc. And I'm wondering if that affected how I read those first three chapters, because I found them cold and clinical, and whilst appreciating what the subject matter is, there was something else there that I couldn't quite put my finger on. And then it was later in, I think it was chapter 4, where she starts to open the door a little, and we meet the true Patricia Wiltshire, I feel, and that's what I suppose automatically I was unconsciously, looking for those little clues. And as the book progressed, for me, the baseline of the story was Patricia, and later she refers to herself as a broken little girl. And I feel that the latter third of the book really focuses upon her needing to have voice. She spent her whole life suffering with numerous losses, particularly that of her own daughter and her beloved grandmother. And she was obviously closer to her grandmother than she was her own mother. There's also the loss connected with her parents separating and so on and so forth. So for me, the book that kind of split into two, in that there was that, her most learned words about her work, but also the empathic response that she evokes in some people, not necessarily all, about her childhood and how she operates as a human being, really. So I thoroughly enjoyed the book. The opening wasn't what I expected. I felt a little like a student in a lecture, but as I said, I think it was that her words about Christian beliefs that made me step back a little. And so I think I need to go back and reread those first three chapters. But wonderful book, and I'm very, very learned lady.
Yes, I think so. Thank you, Terry. That's interesting. I think the opening pages will either get someone's back up or make someone go, oh yeah, I agree. And she takes no prisoners. She just says what she wants to say. And Anne P, that was something you mentioned, as she doesn't. There's no sense that she's trying to write for anybody or trying to please anybody. She just says what she thinks, doesn't she?
No, she's very factual. And I agree, there were some words I had to look up, and I had to write down the definition of forensicology and polynology because I kept on forgetting. We're going in one ear and out the other. But I found I learned a huge amount from this book. I mean, one of the things, going slightly off subject here, but I found fascinating was the fact about bees. It's just a little aside. And I thought I knew a fair bit about bees because we used to keep them when I was a child, but I never knew that, for example, the static electricity is how pollen sticks to their legs, and bees have positive and pollen has negative. And that, just as a little aside in the book where it's possibly not hugely relevant, I found there were lots of little things like that that I never knew that I picked up. And I agree with you, Claire. I think she writes the facts as she sees them and doesn't attempt to pretty it up. Which I enjoyed. I liked having that and not having the overlay of possibly romanticized writing on it, because I do think this is a subject that does need to be treated with respect and seriousness, and I do think she treats it with respect, even though, as Terry says, she does come across in the beginning as quite unemotional. I think she does show later on that is because, as she says, her heart was completely broken, and it's quite an interesting book in the two halves, as Terry mentioned.
Yes. It's also interesting that a couple of people have spoken about the book already, and no one's really talked much about the crimes and the ditches in which she finds herself and the mud which she has to fling around, because we're all drawn to looking at her as a person and trying to find out why she is writing in the way she's writing. And Adaeze, you mentioned the fact when we were talking earlier that you felt it was like a memoir. It was like a memoir. It was like her masterwork of her life, not just a book about her job.
Yeah. And I suppose, just to add to what Anne P and Terry mentioned, I found her way of writing quite engaging. Like myself, I'm not particularly interested in forensic material or forensic studies. And honestly, when I picked it up, I didn't think I was going to finish it because that's not a style of book or content or book I'm usually. But I think I was quite engaged with the way she wrote, though factual, but at a language level that non-specialists can understand and follow. And that line of work is not something that is particularly interesting, but I was engaged from beginning to the end. The way she simplified it, even the technical terms. I think the polling, the technical term for polling, she kept going back to, but I was able to be engaged with the material and her style of writing. And like everybody else, I found the book in halves. The first half was quite pedantic, just this is what you need to do, this is how it works. But towards the end, there was that emotional connection, how her life journeys affected the work she did. And what else I found interesting in her style of writing is, or even the type of work she did, I didn't realize those kind of things existed till I read the book, how simple things like the way you worked, the pollen or the dust on your shoe and underneath your shoe and your tires can affect and actually help in solving mysteries or in solving crimes. So I think it's quite an interesting book if you can get beyond the first 20-30 pages. And it's easily understandable, it's accessible. You don't have to know the technical jargon to be able to make meaning out of her writing. So really, yeah, I am pleased I read it.
Yeah, that's good. And I do think I wouldn't have picked up a a murder mystery or the kind of forensic crime books, which are really, really popular. But I'm really glad. But I do like watching them on telly, and I was glad that I found out that she's quite scathing about some of the real life television programs, and about how actually it's really not that glamorous, and it's spending days and days looking at tiny bits of microscopic stuff under a microscope. And I thought that was all really interesting, the fact that she actually gave us a reality check about those kind of things. Janice, did you feel that it gave you an insight into that line of work? Was that something you were interested in?
Yes. I mean, obviously, the most immediate comparison is NCIS, where they work their magic in various laboratories, and it's done that they're always on a time schedule. It's always done within minutes. And I think, you know, she very laboriously goes through each of the cases, the precise procedures with which she has to go through, and the way that she had to invent those or create those, built on her experience of archaeology and medical research. So that was fascinating, seeing that growth, because the TV can give the impression that the computers sort all that out. But of course, those programs need a lot of modeling, and you know, she's doing her own modeling through her real life. I'm sure, although she's quite scathing as to the quality of science teaching at universities, etc. now, but I'm sure there will be programs that do have that knowledge based on real people, but that knowledge, it will get better over time. But I thought that's what I was, like the other readers, I wouldn't have come to this, I wouldn't have picked this up in a bookshop and thinking I must read this. But when I saw it, the most immediate obvious comparison to me is NCIS, and put a reality check. What I would sort of add to that, I did find it a fascinating book rather than a book I really loved. But I think once you'd gone through one case and the precise procedures, I possibly didn't need to know that in-depth analysis for each of the cases, which there was a lot of similarity in the process. I know each one was a different case, but I would perhaps, as a reader, have liked to know a little bit more about the case, or about the court case, or about what happened to the perpetrator, or something else to give a flavour, because after a while, each of the cases did tend to blur from one into another.
Yeah, she seemed to be avoiding that information, didn't she? I think she was playing that close to her chest, and so she was very focusing on her own part in those things, without perhaps wanting to, I suppose, encourage people to guess which case it was, because I think some of them were high profile.
Oh, absolutely. And I think I take on the first points about, I would think it's about any established religion rather than Christianity per se. It was, as I say, that practical thoughts as to her view on life, she really goes into in the final chapter, and gives substance as to her thoughts, and actually the thought of her and the person that she loved being reincarnated through different ways. I'll try not to say too much. I thought was actually the most emotional, romantic part, in contrast to some very cold figures at the beginning. But I think it is useful to see what could go on behind TV. I think that was fascinating.
Yeah. Thank you. It was. I thought some of the writing. I didn't see her as a natural writer, a stylist or anything like that, which is why I think we get quite an honest view of her. So sometimes the language will be very scientific, and she's stating her case that she's very pragmatic, she's not spiritual, she says all these things, and yet sometimes she would wax quite eloquently about a pollen or a fungi, or about someone in her life, her grandmother, for example, and various other people, and she would become clearly very emotional. So it's very much, as Terry was saying, there is the person trying to be this controlled writer who is telling you about her expertise and in this scientific field, and there is the person who is also letting you know about her lots of sadnesses from her childhood and her adult life, and also things that are beautiful and are challenging her pragmatism, which is a little conflict within herself. Anne W, did you find the writing appealing?
Not particularly. It's difficult. I had very mixed feelings about the book. I'm glad I read it. I probably wouldn't have either picked it up or finished it if it hadn't been for a book club. I found it interesting rather than enjoyable. I'm not very scientifically orientated at all, so that to me was quite hard going. And I agree with the view that maybe it got a bit repetitive on the different cases, on the technical stuff. I mean, it wasn't obviously repetitive precisely, but reading it as a non-scientist, it got perhaps quite difficult to follow. Like somebody else, I had to write down some of the terms and try to remember what they all were. Similarly to what Terry said right at the beginning, the comments about life after death or not produced to me as a believer of fairly negative reaction, but I just went with it, and I agree. She became more engaged with things and less distant. I felt there was something quite tricky about the tone of the book, which might fit in with perhaps some analysis of what the writer was like. It was quite, this is the view that you need to take. I mean, it wasn't set out like a persuasive argument, but there was a kind of aura about it that you had to just go along with what she was saying, which obviously on the factual stuff about the analysis would be right, but it was too much there in everything else. I felt I find it quite hard to explain what I mean there. It's just a feeling about the way it was written. But anyway, I'm sorry, that's not.
No, I think I understand what you're saying. But she was saying, yes, very, very much. This is the truth. This is and because that was her view of her job, where you could do that, she was also perhaps applying it for the less definable things about life, which are about emotional life and people's beliefs and so on, which are less. Perhaps she wasn't as comfortable with that. Does anyone else want to say anything about the language that she used?
I think if we go back to my initial statement about the first 3 chapters being very cold and clinical, particularly when she's speaking about death itself. Later on, and I think Janice, you referred to this, her approach becomes gentler, and I think that occurs after she's actually started to speak about her as a person and not just as a forensic scientist. She's let the public in, as it were. And so when she speaks about what happens to us when we die, and I quite agree with that, yes, we know the science of it and the disintegration, but, we become food for the earth, as it were. But I do feel that later on in the book there is this much gentler approach to that. So for me, I think writing this book has been a tremendous journey for her, a tremendous personal journey, and not just an achievement as an author.
Yeah. Adaeze, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I guess for me, when you talk about the language, there are times when I read the book, I didn't find it comfortable, the language she used to describe other competitors or other people in the profession. At times it was disparaging of what they did, or the how good those other people were, which I felt that's not professional. And even if they were not good in what they did and you were excellent or a cream of the cream, I didn't want to read about comparisons. I just want to know what you did and how well you are, not to compare yourselves to other people. So yeah, there are times I felt that wasn't really necessary to use that language.
I think that's another element of her not really caring what other people think, but also not really trying to second guess what people might think and go, actually, this might look a bit unprofessional, or this might look a bit like sour grapes, or she just said she judged something and then said they're rubbish, or they weren't good enough, and so it did make, again, it made her sound cold, and then at other points she would sound as if she was fonder of people.
I just wanted to echo what you were saying there, and I don't know whether other people thought like this, but you know, being brought up in South Wales, a very male orientated society, I'm not trying to put too much into that, but there were quite a few telling statements where, I think it was when she was in Albania, about how they treated women and trying to get and I think sometimes, you know, she comes up, well, she says she's small and diminutive but again, without having, there's no statistics, or I don't know, but did you say take a size 3 shoe, or
yeah,
she's got very small,
yeah,
she sounds so I feel gargantuan compared with her, but she seemed to be very much of, although I'm small, I know a lot, and don't take me seriously. And I just wonder whether, without meaning to, whether she's trying to convey that despite her size and despite being a female, she's somebody to be you know, to be taken seriously and respected because of this breadth of knowledge. So even though she may not actually have to fight her corner here, working in such a male dominated world at various times, and things have changed a lot over, you know, she was born in the 40s, things have changed enormously. She might have felt that she's really had a case to prove. I think she went into her botany degree because her then husband wanted her to do something a bit more ladylike than the lab work, you know. So there's always that constant of maybe trying to prove herself by that. I just wonder whether the people pick that or it's just a personal thought.
I think her place as a woman in the world is key, really, to and the fact that she has to say, I don't give a damn what anyone says, because if I gave a damn, I'd never have got where I was. And so she's kind of followed that through. And I thought she's one of those people that she is clearly feminist in her views that women can do whatever they want to put their minds to, and they're as intelligent as men, and they can be in the same field. But she's not particularly interested in tub thumping or making a feminist point or a social point. She just says what she sees, says the effect it has on her, and kind of moves on. And I found that quite refreshing, really, because she doesn't really do woe is me, even though she had some, you know, some terrible things have happened. She doesn't wallow in anything. And, you know, even things that have happened to her that clearly have been defining and must give her constant grief and upset, she says, well, yeah, that's part of me, and on we go with the next thing. So I found that quite refreshing about her voice, really. But I do agree, I think that her place as a woman in the world is really key. Would we recommend this book to people we know in book groups, or our families and friends that read? Does anyone want to?
I think it would need to be people that we know well, because, as Anne W said, it would be too gruesome for some, because it is very much, this is it, this is fact. And particularly during the pandemic, when there are sadly so many people dying.
Yes. And we mentioned, some of you I know had the audiobook, and some of us had the ebook, and in the ebook there are photographs, and the photos themselves aren't particularly gruesome, but I'm just going to read two of the titles. One says, washing the hair of a decaying corpse to retrieve trace evidence, and then one says, teaching police in Lima, Peru, how to sample a corpse for fungi. And so although they're not explicit photographs, but someone who doesn't like the idea of that will probably not enjoy this book, would they? I think that's what you're saying, Terry.
And I think that's the advantage of the audiobook, that you hear it, you create your own view, which is what you can cope with without having a view in front of you. So I would suggest that if you're a little feeling you'd be put off by that, I would listen to the book, so that you get the sense of the life lived and the work done,
without having to look at the pics. Would you agree, Anne W?
Yes, I mean, I've never really used audiobooks, so I don't quite know how it comes across. I mean, I think it's a book I would mention at our next local book club meeting. I wouldn't put it on when it's my turn to sort of do recommendations of one that we choose to read, but I just generally tell people about it. And I think there are probably some people there who might enjoy it, or think they wanted to read it, but not everybody.
No. Anne Penn as a librarian, what would you, who would you recommend it to?
Yes, well, funnily enough, I would recommend it to my mother.
Okay.
She would really love this, and I was trying to work out the ages. I think I worked out that Patricia must be about 78. So, and I do think, as we've already talked, the age growing up, and my mother, who's in her 80s, would love this book. So I do think we need to not stereotype people sometimes as well. But one thing actually I just mentioned quickly, that we've talked about her life as a woman. I also think her life growing up in a tiny, small mining village in Wales, because the value of education, she got where she went to by being able to go to a grammar school and going stupendous places through the value of education. So that's something that I thought was really interesting.
Massive overachiever. Yes. She'd be described as.
And yes, definitely.
She was very dismissive.
Yeah, I would.
Sorry, go on.
No, carry on.
On that note, she was quite dismissive of her parents. She loved her grandmother, but her parents, along the line, somebody somewhere was saying to her, "You have these books, you have this time." It wasn't just her grandmother. So within that society, the notion of going to school and bettering yourself, even for a girl, clearly it did exist at that time. So I think although she did overachieve and she was remarkable compared to her peers, she was within an environment which was encouraging her and allowed her to get where she did.
Yes, I think the value of a really good education at that time and the way people could rise was key to the time. The fact that you could get a good education, whatever start in life you come from, I think come through. But yeah, I actually think Anne explained it very well, that you definitely would have to know. Well, I'd say this about any recommendation: you should recommend something you know the other person is going to like, not something that you have liked, because it depends on what type of books other people do. So there would be people I'd recommend this to, and others I know just would not like this at all.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But it sounds as though we all are quite pleased we read it. Would that be an accurate?
Yes. Oh yes.
Yeah, it's so although we've all had quite strong reactions to it and not always positive ones, it does seem to me, for me, it seems a very different sort of book, not just to the ones I normally read, but also just as a book. It's quite unusual, and I think that what you've said has brought that out, and hopefully people who are watching this can, well, if you're watching this, feel free to make some comments as well and share your thoughts. But I think we're saying this is one that we all enjoyed reading, are glad we read, but wouldn't necessarily recommend very widely. But I think that people who would appreciate it will really appreciate it. So it's one of those interesting titles. It has sold really well because of the CSI interest, I think, and it's been borrowed widely as well. But yeah, it's pretty much a one-off, which you can't say very often. I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you ever so much to everybody, particularly our guest panelists, for coming along and adding such intelligent thoughts and conversation to our discussion. Our next book in February is going to be The Sparsholt Affair by Alan Hollinghurst, very different literary novel. So we look forward to discussing that, and we'll be sending out lots of information about that too. But meanwhile, thank you to all my guests, to Anne P and Anne W, and to Janice, Adaeze and Terry, and thank you for watching, and we hope to see you again next time. Thank you. Bye bye.